Good. Well, welcome everybody to this discussion meeting. Discussion is going to be led by Ben Barry, who's our land warfare, land forces analyst here at the Institute, and as such forms part of the wider defence and military analysis program. The core task of the defence and military analysis program is to produce the annual military balance publication. And that's, of course, a book that contains an immense volume of data on military holdings and on defence economics. When we established the defence and military analysis program a couple of years ago or so in its current shape, we were very clear that we wanted it to conduct several strands of research activities in parallel to the production of the book, with the twin objectives of extrapolating some analytical observations from the immense volumes of data it contains, but also to impose some intellectual order on it, and more particularly to situate it in ongoing defence policy debates. Now, the perennial challenge that refers to is, of course, that defence forces have to be structured ideally to account for current contingencies and conflicts, and also to have the ability to adapt in preparation for meeting future contingencies and conflicts. That's a perennial challenge, but it's made more difficult at the moment by the fiscal and budgetary environment that most countries are wrestling with, which makes those choices harder to arbitrate in a very definite way. So Ben, I think, is going to set out for us not only the breadth and depth of the dilemmas that armies face in arbitrating those choices, but suggesting perhaps where some of those choices are going to have to fall. He'll speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll use the balance of the time for questions and comments. Ben.
Since the end of the Cold War, the majority of war has been on land. Of course, the long land wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have been more difficult and costly than expected. There's a huge range of armies in the world, from relatively unsophisticated forces who are optimised for internal security, through armies for national defence, such as those of South Korea, Turkey and Russia, to NATO armies with wholly expeditionary capabilities. And of course, the US Army and Marines have a full spectrum expeditionary capability and global reach and influence. But even they have to make hard choices. Land forces are big business. Although their equipment's less expensive than aircraft or ships, there are greater numbers. For example, both the US and Indian armies are replacing their infantry fighting vehicles, a couple of thousand units each. Armies still offer big opportunities for defence industry, and the size of armies mean that logistics and training are themselves big business. Now, I appreciate that as we're in London, there's a lot of interest in NATO and European armies, and indeed the British Army. But I want to try and keep this conversation as general as I can, though if you want to go into specifics afterwards, more than happy to do so. So let's talk about firstly the hard fighting, then the hard times, and then the hard choices. Of course, on the beginning of September 2001, many armies, defence manufacturers and theorists thought they were seeing a revolution in military affairs, the RMA, where greatly improved surveillance, communications and precision strike weapons would produce superior knowledge of the enemy, better targeted and more effective strikes, and manoeuvre, and allow a networked force to defeat a less modern one. Now, things didn't quite work out like that in the three types of land war we've seen over the last decade. The first type of land war is state versus state war. The US-led attack on Afghanistan in 2001, on Iraq in 2003, the 2008 Georgia War, and to a certain extent NATO's attack on the Libyan regime in 2011. These all showed the vulnerability of conventional armies that fought conventionally against an opponent with air superiority and superior ISTAR, that is, intelligence, surveillance, technology and reconnaissance, a term I'll have to use often, and superior firepower. But what these wars also showed is that the enduring tactical principles proven in land warfare since 1918 still applied. That is, combined arms tactics integrating infantry, armour, artillery and engineers, and also air-land integration, particularly the synergy that comes from integrating air attacks with land operations, whether the land component is an intervening army or an indigenous force assisted by special forces. The second type of war we've seen has been state versus insurgents, the prolonged and difficult counterinsurgency in Iraq and Afghanistan, where the US, coalition and NATO forces struggled to adapt. Initially, the revolution in military affairs seemed to offer little to hard-pressed US and coalition forces grappling with an elusive insurgency. Capabilities that had worked so well against conventional forces gave little traction against irregulars who blended into the civilian population. And by creating a false confidence in US Defence Secretary Rumsfeld and others that Iraq and Afghanistan could be stabilised with insufficient forces, the RMA contributed to strategic miscalculation. Now, this nation building under fire, as many British officers christened it, showed that insurgents can pose significant challenges, often adapting more quickly than Western armies and fielding a mix of low and high technology capability. But I think those wars also confirmed that the classic principles of insurgency and counterinsurgency applied, and also that numbers counted, not only having large numbers of intervening security boots on the ground, but also growing training and mentoring indigenous forces. The third type of conflict we've seen has been hybrid conflict. The best example of this is the 2006 Lebanon War, where Hezbollah displayed a mixture of irregular and regular capabilities, and the Israelis had rude shocks, not least those arising from unrealistic expectations of what the network could achieve and what precision weapons could do. And this was exacerbated by insufficient training in combined arms and joint warfighting. Now, many of those hard lessons appear to have been applied by the Israeli forces to their conflict against Hamas in Gaza, albeit against a less capable enemy. Now, I can see some strategic trends across these wars. They show there's no substitute for well-trained and well-led forces with a credible plan. For example, the Georgia War of 2008, where rapid execution of an effective Russian land-sea-air plan rapidly unhinged the Georgian defences. They also reaffirmed that fighting is the core military capability. Now, this might sound blindingly obvious, but many Western armies had spent the 1990s achieving results in the Balkans pretty much just by being there. And if there was a decisive moment in this, it's the 2004 Shia uprising in Iraq that made it clear that against opponents who were determined to fight, armed forces that were unable to fight or whose governments wouldn't let them fight were of little utility. And of course, this then became an issue in Afghanistan. So the demands of Iraq and Afghanistan also required armies to train for both fighting and stabilisation, which was expensive in time and money and reduced the utility of conscripts. Fighting was often as intense as that experienced in World War II, and there was an unexpected scale of threat from improvised explosive devices, IEDs, which came as a strategic shock. Now, the unpopularity of Iraq and Afghanistan wars meant that for the US and NATO, protecting the force became the top tactical and equipment priority, resulting in a host of new protective equipment, protected vehicles, and counter-IED equipment being fielded. And counter-IED became core activity for all deployed troops, complemented by development of specialist capabilities. Infantry has been the dominant army branch in counterinsurgency and in urban operations. Considerable efforts were made to improve infantry capability, but I don't think these have yet resulted in a decisive increase in infantry effectiveness, mainly because the weight of the additional equipment, particularly body armour, has greatly slowed people down. But with their combination of firepower, mobility and protection, tanks and armoured vehicles played a decisive role in the attack on Iraq, the Russian attack on Georgia, and the initial Gaddafi regime attempts to defeat the Libyan rebels. But it's an inconvenient truth that many Taliban, Iraqi and Libyan tanks and armoured vehicles were destroyed by missiles and bombs from the air. In counterinsurgency, the tank's primary role has been fighting insurgents rather than fighting other tanks. The firepower generated by the insurgents has meant that the firepower from armoured vehicles has been invaluable, as has intimate tactical cooperation between armour and infantry. But much of this mobile protected firepower was supplied by armoured vehicles other than tanks. Of course, we also saw ever-increasing pressure to reduce civilian casualties, which required an ever-increasing use of precision, including guided mortars, artillery and rockets, as well as choosing to use less lethal rather than more lethal warheads. But precision weapons depended on improvements in ISTAR, particularly by greatly expanding and decentralising intelligence capabilities and a massive investment in manned and unmanned air platforms. Iraq and Afghanistan eventually saw US and NATO troops exhibit tactical adaptation. For example, towards the end of the Iraq War and in Afghanistan, we've seen offensive clearance operations coordinated at division and even corps level. These demonstrated common success factors: concentrating sufficient force, adequate airborne capability above them, integrated with influence operations and reconstruction. The more the operations involved local forces, giving an indigenous face to build empathy with the civil population, the better. Now, those were counterinsurgency operations. I think those are pointers, more broadly, to success factors in future land operations as a whole. So that's the hard fighting. What about the hard times? Well, the hardest factor is global defence spending falling overall in real terms. The trend, of course, varies regionally. It's falling in the US, NATO and Europe, but rising in Russia, Asia, the Middle East and Latin America. And that's covered extremely clearly in the military balance. I call what we're living through in the US and Europe the age of gloom, a prevailing gloom about the utility of force arising from the unpopularity of Iraq and Afghan wars, their apparent intractability and their cost in blood. But it's ironic that this is at a time when improvements in capability resulting from those wars, particularly ISTAR and precision weapons, offer options for waging war with less civilian casualties and collateral damage. And many actors are busy using force on land. The Pakistani Taliban and insurgents, of which there's no shortage in Latin America, Africa and Asia. In places, gangs, organised criminals and narcotic barons overmatch the police, requiring extensive military support to the police, for example in parts of Brazil and Mexico. More UN peacekeepers are deployed on land than ever, and there's no shortage of flashpoints on land: the Korean Peninsula, India's borders, both with Pakistan and China. And countries that might confront the West are investing in and sometimes using land force, for example, North Korea and Iran. And that has provoked enhancements to the South Korean and Gulf armies. And Syria is an extremely complex conflict, a combination of insurgency and civil war. We also see Brazil, India, Russia, China and other rising economies converting some of their increasing prosperity into improved land warfare capabilities, as well as air and maritime capabilities. We see army modernisation. For example, Brazil is increasing and updating its armoured vehicles. Last week, Qatar announced the purchase of a brigade's worth of top-of-the-range modern German armour. The Indian army is growing, and the Russian and Chinese armies have extensive modernisation programmes. So, the centre of gravity of my talk, the hard choices. There is a great range of sizes, shapes and roles of world armies. Some are determined adherents to the Western way of war. Others, such as Iran and North Korea, plan to fight Western or Western-style forces, so have to plan to counter the Western way of war. Some armies are all regular, some conscript. Others are militias, or guerrilla forces, or any combination of those. And some countries, like the United States, Iran and the UAE, have two armies. Just about the only thing I can think of in common between those three countries. Of course, the armies that are involved in Afghanistan have more or less been optimised for counterinsurgency, and that's an operational design very different from that needed for combined arms land manoeuvre. It depends on static bases, lavish support from contractors, lavish logistics, and also unprecedented access to bandwidth and processing power uncontested by electronic attack. Now, after these armies withdraw from Afghanistan, they'll need to refurbish worn-out equipment and reconstitute their capability to perform whatever the roles are required of them by their broader defence policy. But many of the advanced conventional weapons that before 9/11 they had previously hoped to procure for conventional warfighting have either been cancelled or delayed, for example, the US Future Combat System. And the additional funding they've been receiving for operations will end. So we already see many NATO and European armies reducing their size and capabilities, the Dutch giving up their tanks, the British reducing their heavy and medium armour holdings by at least a third. So Western armies face a lot of pretty stark choices, all driven by affordability and budget. And that, of course, is driven by increasing cost of equipment and also the expense of and competition for quality people, which is also subject to inflationary pressure. And those same pressures apply everywhere, even outside NATO and the West, because even large armies with expanding budgets, like the Indian and Chinese armies, can't afford large quantities of everything. So all armies will assess the lessons of the last decade, and it's likely that some of these lessons and some of the capabilities fielded will have an enduring utility. These may well include air-land integration, precision artillery, improvements to infantry, but other capabilities may be judged as less relevant, for example, heavily protected patrol vehicles, such as the US MRAP, which has a minimal ability to move cross-country. But I think in the long term we can discern three strategic challenges that all armies face. The first challenge is to identify what the army can do that other capabilities can't. Now, in theory, this should be determined by national defence policy and priorities and strategic geography. In practice, Clausewitz's trinity, people, army and government, often now interact in a complex mix of attitudes, resource allocation, decisions and non-decisions that are now affected by mass media in a way that would amaze Clausewitz. In the US and UK, I sense that some politicians, officials and media commentators think that Afghanistan and Iraq were so problematic that we won't be doing anything like that again soon, thanks. Many suggest that the increasing importance of the Gulf and the US pivot to Asia mean that air, maritime, amphibious and special forces are of much greater utility than old-fashioned armies. So accepting a basic premise that armies cannot do what navies and air forces can, what are their roles? Quite a good mission statement the US Army has: to fight on land as part of an integrated joint force and conduct prompt and sustained combined arms manoeuvre. That's about as good as any other one. Of course, whilst the other two services can attack enemy land forces, only armies can defeat them. They can secure ground and the people living on the ground and exert influence over populations that air or sea power struggles to do. And this also allows them to protect and support other agencies such as diplomats, development and intelligence agencies. So a force that can root out and defeat enemies and exert control over terrain and people can achieve land control, which is as valid a concept as sea control or air control. Funny old thing, but we hear it less often. And actually we hear the terms sea power and air power less often than we see the term land power. Armies also represent political commitment, including the willingness to accept risk and act as an escalatory tool. And we saw this in the Kosovo campaign. We also saw it last December when Israel's air and missile attack on Gaza was accompanied by the mobilisation of several brigades, which, if used, would have allowed Israel to more greatly degrade Hamas's rockets, albeit at increased civilian casualties and collateral damage. The way I see it is, if you're having a dispute with the owner of a china shop, you might begin by threatening him with an aggressive terrier, or maybe escalate to a thick-set Rottweiler, but you may eventually have to threaten the use of a bull. The second challenge is to work out how armies will operate in the future. Armies can get this right, and they often do. For example, the British and US armies' preparations in the Cold War to fight World War III made them uniquely suited to Operation Desert Storm. But by both climbing aboard the RMA bandwagon and discarding hard lessons of Vietnam and Northern Ireland, they came with an inch of defeat in Iraq. There's plenty of thinking going on, not least in Russia, China, India, and Singapore as an example. But we see most of US and UK thinking of this, and they consider Iraq and Afghanistan to be signposts to the future, rightly pointing out that state-on-state conflict hasn't gone away, but seeing that state adversaries would seek to exploit Western weakness by seeking to fight both symmetrically and asymmetrically. There's nothing new about symmetric and asymmetric conflict occurring simultaneously. The American War of Independence, the Peninsula War, and Vietnam all show this. The US Army articulates this in their published capstone concept, and they logically derive that an army's got to be able to do both combined arms and joint war fighting, as well as wide area security, the latter embracing both counterinsurgency and peace support operations. And US thinking is important because their plans and programme of the Army and the Marine Corps has such resource dominance over Western defence industry and also the thinking of Western and Western-aligned forces to be a significant influence, and it also influences the approach of those who might fight the West. Although many armies will want to fight alongside US or NATO formations, none can afford the full spectrum of US capability and technology, and actually the US can't afford it itself. But you can see alternative approaches to the Western way of war, for example in the ground forces of Iran and North Korea, which emphasises a mixture of irregular asymmetric capabilities operating in conjunction with conventional ground troops. I'd also observe that all recent wars have been amongst the people, and this is likely to continue given the global mega-trend of urbanisation. So it's likely that most land conflict will increasingly take place not just around, but inside villages, towns and cities. Urban operations will no longer be exceptional, more likely the new normal. The British Army is working hard to exploit this. I don't know how many other armies are. The third challenge is to identify the capabilities that the Army needs to do its job. Now this is an area of fantastic choice, not just of military technology, but also of relevant civilian technology. But there's much more to capability than just equipment. To get a unit or formation to be combat ready, equipment has to be coordinated with the remainder of what the British call the lines of development: organisation, doctrine, people, information, infrastructure and training. In the public space, this is often inadequately understood, as most of the defence press tend to focus on equipment and organisation. But I'd like to highlight a few key areas where I think hard choices have to be made. First of all, protection. And I think this is something that has fundamentally changed, and we now see many Western armies insisting on very high levels of protection, which drives up the size, weight and cost of their armoured vehicles. Elsewhere, though, we see armies requiring much less inherent protection. For example, many Latin American, African and Asian armies are content to field less well protected but lighter and cheaper armoured vehicles. This directly impacts on the second area of choice, mobility. And there is an increasing order of expense about how you move army capability around. Feet, trucks, wheeled armour, tracked armour, transport aircraft with or without parachutes, amphibious shipping and helicopters. And there are complex trade-offs here, which of course are influenced by the Army's role and budgets. But I would note that we've seen over the last decade that the enemy has an inconvenient habit of demolishing things like bridges and liberally scattering both landmines and IEDs over the landscape. And this requires combat engineers, a capability that many armies seem to be under-provisioned with. Now, firepower. There's an almost infinite variety of choice here. For example, in Afghanistan right now, a British company commander can drop explosives onto the heads of Taliban fighters using 3 different grenade launchers, javelin missiles, light and medium mortars, artillery, guided rockets, attack helicopters with cannon rockets and missiles, and bombs and missiles from UAVs and fast jets, some of which also have cannon. Now, how much of this overlap and duplication can be afforded after Afghanistan is a moot point. Although I would note that recent reports suggesting that indirect fire precision attack weapons with a man in the loop, such as the Israeli Spike NLOS missile, are proving especially useful. There's also a choice between relatively expensive precision systems and larger numbers of simpler, dumber systems. And there is evidence that we've seen over the last decade a constant contest between insurgents and high-tech defensive systems. For example, between IEDs and NATO forces in Afghanistan. Another example is the contest between Hamas rockets and the Israeli defence system Iron Dome. And this suggests that for all their sophistication, top-of-the-range sophisticated systems can eventually be overwhelmed by cheaper numbers of simpler ordnance, if enough of it is used. I wonder if we see this in the modernisation of the Russian and Chinese armies. At first sight, their brigades look very similar to Western brigades, but they have about 3 times as much artillery. And I wonder if this reflects an analysis that many modern Western land weapons can be countered simply by drenching the real estate in large quantities of high explosive and smoke. Now, war on land also includes the ability to integrate not only the traditional combined arms and joint firepower, but also, as we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan, a wide variety of other effects and agencies: reconstruction, development, information operations. Now, before 9/11, many Western armies saw these as peripheral, and if they had the capabilities, they were usually generated from the reserves. Now, there's an active debate in the US Army that these capabilities, and also all the enablers you need to do building security forces and security partnership, should be as core a warfighting function in their own right. And there's a debate right now about what they're calling the seventh warfighting function. This relates to a question that was posed by the Commanding General of the US Training and Doctrine Command, and I'll just quote from a recent article in Military Review. Specialised skills are essential for successful operations. These specialised skills required of soldiers today and in the future are articulated by me as the new norms. They include cultural and language proficiency, negotiation, digital literacy, cyberspace activity, space knowledge, weapons technical intelligence and site exploitation. These specialised skills must now become universal tasks. For most armies, I'm afraid it's far from clear to me how they're going to do this, although there is a debate and moves in hand in the US and UK armies. We've also seen the role of unmanned vehicles intimately cooperating with land forces and decentralised to low tactical levels, and this is likely to continue to increase. Now, not only does this mean unmanned aircraft, but it also means unmanned ground vehicles, and I'm very surprised that outside of the US we see very, very little evidence of work in public on the potential of unmanned ground vehicles, other than in explosive ordnance disposal. What I do see, though, is some armies leveraging a new technology which they didn't envisage 15 years ago, which is simulation technology, for which the R&D is much of the R&D is being done at commercial expense by the civilian gaming industry. Now, this can never completely replicate the frictions of real manoeuvre on real terrain by real forces, but there's plenty of evidence that it can accelerate the learning of individuals and teams, it can improve effectiveness, it can allow mission rehearsal in cyberspace, and it also allows much quicker experimentation. Now, there's a lot I've not covered. It, for example, includes information operations, of which there's at least one expert in the room, logistics, medical, light forces, airborne and amphibious forces, electronic warfare, signals intelligence and cyber, ground reconnaissance, battlefield helicopters, command and control, recruiting retention, the role of women, guerrilla and insurgent armies, innovation and adaptation in armies, and why the First World War is much more relevant than many people think. So that's enough to offend almost everybody in the room, I think. Over the coming months, I plan to hold a series of events on land warfare topics, which will be worthy of study in their own right, but taken together, what I want to do is create a conversation about land forces, land capability and land operations that should help commentators, decision makers, practitioners and defence industry better understand current and future land operations and capabilities. And I'm looking forward for your feedback.
Good. Thank you very much, Ben, for what was really a research agenda camouflaged as a talk. And as you mentioned, you'll get into some of these topics in greater detail and focus later on in the series of talks and some of your written output too. But it'd be good to gather some comments and some questions on the very broad range of issues that Ben has addressed. If you'd like to ask a question or make an intervention, just catch my eye. And for the benefit of everybody here, just introduce yourself as well. Maybe give your affiliation when you do that. Yes, you sir, at the back of the room.
Very good talk. Thank you very much indeed. You skirted around the subject which has now come to prominence as drones, which is a tremendous correspondence going on. You know, the fact that you don't have a man on board might make you more warlike or less warlike. I wonder if you can expand at all on that particular topic and the question of the man in the loop.
There's no doubt that drones for both surveillance and strike in Iraq and Afghanistan have proved enormously useful. But of course this is an environment where the US and NATO has controlled the airspace and their communications have been uncontested. Against a state that could challenge those, UAV's utility could well be reduced. What's also the case is that manned aircraft have often performed this role, performed it either more cheaply or certainly no more expensively. For example, the USAC 130, various bespoke manned platforms that are orbiting Afghanistan right now. But again, they've been able to take advantage of control of airspace, control of bandwidth. So I think investing in drones, it will be highly situation dependent, because if you've got an army that aims to fight someone who actually will control the air and interfere with their communications, then drones are going to be of limited utility in the sort of role they're used in Afghanistan and Iraq now. I just offer, though, that on the sort of intersection of the law, morals and ethics, where drones are used in accordance with the law of armed conflict, or indeed relevant domestic legislation, as long as there's an operator in the loop, that shouldn't be any different from a manned aircraft or indeed a manned armoured vehicle. So they do have tremendous utility. What I think we're probably seeing, though, now is an enormous proliferation of much smaller drones. The British just unveiled the Black Hornet, of which I could probably fit half a dozen in a controller, on this little desk space here. And I think we're also going to see a proliferation of drones for civilian purposes, which will also drive this. And whereas bigger drones will be very easy for air defence systems to counter, and indeed for other aircraft to shoot down, these small proliferated drones, I think we're going to see a lot more of them.
Richard Norton-Taylor?
I'm actually going on amongst other things. I don't want to be too parochial, but the Queen actually mentioned reserves in her speech this morning, I think. I just wondered if you've got any new intelligence on reserve, the role of reserves, and how optimistic or pessimistic the government's plans. Albeit talking about specialist skills, which you did a few moments ago. Is there can it work that the government's plans on the importance, future importance of reservists, this government in particular wants to see?
Well, we're away. I don't know what the Queen said, but
she said there'll be moves to measures to.
My intelligence is that before recess, we're likely to see a single announcement by the Defence Secretary, both of a white paper, which may or may not recommend some additional legislation, and the British Army is yet to announce the reorganisation of the Territorial Army as the final part of its Army 2020. Personally, I think this can be done. I'm not nearly as pessimistic as many commentators, but it will require the real money that's been allocated for it, and it will require real imagination and also a very frank dialogue between the regular army, the reserves, and indeed employers. And some of that dialogue needs to be uncomfortable. I was once an expert on the British Army Reserves before the Iraq War, and part of the trick with employers is that there's a frank conversation between reserves and employers, and the position of people who want to be in the reserves but also want to work in a small business, that's never going to be comfortable, no matter how much resources and how much legal protection you throw at it. But Richard, there's a more general point here. Why am I confident? Because I have seen some very effective alternative models on a global scale of doing reserves. I've certainly felt that there's much to be learned from the US, which, just as the US has two armies, it's got three reserve armies: the Marine Corps Reserve, the National Guard, who are the Fourth Civilian Emergency Service, and the Army Reserve. But I've also seen some very interesting illustrations from the reserves of Canada, New Zealand, and Australia that I've had the privilege to command. And there are some countries where actually a model that integrates conscript national service and a large reserve component actually works pretty well. And if I take Singapore, where again they have a slightly different model, it does work for them.
Yes, you think, front row?
Brian Holdenbury, King's College London. Ben, I was very interested in the way you began your talk with your critical comments on the use of the term revolution in military affairs. And I have a comment, really. We saw how many revolutions in military affairs in the 20th century? It must be something like a dozen. and not one of them has had the revolutionary effect that has been claimed. So perhaps I could make the plea that we do not use this term again in the future, because it is pernicious and dangerous, and given the title of this institution, also stimulates strategic illusions.
Maybe a diversion in military affairs, I don't know.
I'd say there was probably one revolution in military affairs that affected land warfare in the 20th century, and we will be commemorating that in 5 years' time with the Battle of Amiens and the 100 Days, where modern combined arms warfare was forged in extremely difficult conditions, and nothing that tactically has been done on land has diverged from those principles since. Brian, I agree with you completely. What I didn't say was that, if you like, I put the case for the prosecution that armies have been misled and Rumsfeld had been misled. What is quite interesting is the art of war as it's being practiced in Afghanistan right now sees many of the tools of that much heralded revolution in military affairs actually being used. You know, vast quantities of bandwidth and processing power, UAVs, space-based surveillance, drones and precision weapons. But the thing is, it's being used in an entirely different way from what was envisaged, because it's being used as part of a counterinsurgency campaign using conventional, or if you like, classic principles of counterinsurgency, in a way that was almost, most of the RMA advocates were in denial about. The real trick, how can armies, or for that matter armed forces and defence ministries, inoculate themselves against believing the hype of revolution in military affairs? Well, it's to have officers and civilian officials who are grounded in a thorough understanding of the history and principles of the art of war, but also who are prepared to experiment. Because if the revolution of military affairs had been tested against a counterinsurgency type model, its deficiencies would have been shown. And I do think, if I can use the word revolution, that the simulation technology that is probably driving those of you parents absolutely nuts as you see your teenage children being sucked into it from time to time. But actually this simulation technology does allow parts of military training to be revolutionised, and it also allows experimentation to be done in virtual environments in a way that previously could not be done. So the bad ideas can be tested in the same sort of simulated battlefield that people are using for training, and they can be exposed as impractical, so then you can go back into the real environment and test the ideas that look to you that are promising.
Gentleman in the fourth row back.
Simon Williams, member of the Ben, you started your talk talking about costs, with reference to perhaps ancient shibboleth that armies equip the man, whereas navies and air forces man the equipment, and therefore there's a cost driver there. But one of those cost drivers is changing in equipping the man. I heard a talk by the Commandant of the US Marine Corps a few weeks ago who said that to equip a soldier or a Marine of 1944 cost the equivalent in today's money of $175 per man for webbing and weapon. The equivalent today is something of the order of $10,500 per man. So, equipping a company is up towards $1 million per company. So actually the cost drivers are changing, which brings, and that's related to the hard fighting, and also related to the hard times, because the other dynamic is that with an all-volunteer force, the costs of keeping large numbers of manpower is not just the cost of having it in the force today, it's the cost of the legacy of pensions and healthcare, which for the US is a very significant number. So is that going to also translate, do you think, to other nations as they convert, such as the Chinese, as they convert to all-volunteer forces and actually challenge the numbers game that is effectively armies occupying territory?
Simon, you've raised some very trenchant points, and the trend of $175 to $10,000 is absolutely spot on. I can't see NATO, US and Western armies reversing that much, because protection, which wasn't the number one factor, will have a generation of people who are scarred by experiences and the unpopular wars that will make protection the unpopular factor. In a couple of jobs I had in the higher management of the British Army, I did ban the phrase armies equip the man, because actually when you look at armoured forces, the centre of gravity is the armoured vehicle. Now some of them carry people to do other things, like infantry fighting vehicles, but actually, you're manning, with armoured vehicles, you're manning the equipment as much as you are with a warship or an aircraft. I think where you have got flexibility, though, is do you match, on the people side, where do you invest in pay, conditions, and training, selection and development? Because and there's potentially some uncomfortable questions that come out of this. Conscript armies, on the whole, get away with paying conscripts pocket money. So the cost of manpower, provided you can train it within the time of their service, can be very, very low. So you can then afford to invest in lots of high technology equipment. And an example that we see is the Army of Singapore, which isn't short of high technology equipment. But I think you also have to ask yourself some questions about the quality of your manpower. Many armies tend to draw their infantry soldiers from the bottom of the socio-economic food chain, least educated, least well nourished, least physically developed, and often from broken homes, people who've lucked out on the social and economic and educational game of snakes and ladders that is their upbringing. Well, if you're actually going to spend the amount of money and put the amount of technology on infantry soldiers that many armies seem to want to do, you have to question how much it's worth investing on people who come from that background, or whether you need to do much more to develop them to make full use of the investment you've put in them.
Jonathan?
Jonathan Marcus, BBC. Not a terribly well thought out question, but I was very struck by your comments on the importance of force protection, in contrast with other armies who may be deploying much more light equipment and so on. And I just wonder how important the sort of what you might call the sort of sociological and cultural factors are in an era of wars of choice for Western style armies. I mean, it's sort of, doesn't want to be sort of blasé about casualties, but it kind of, one tends to feel the best way of protecting the force is to kill the other side. If, because of the unpopularity of the military engagements we pursue, the key objective is actually to reduce casualties per se, at a cost to mobility or flexibility or whatever it may be. How far do you think it's the sort of social attitudes to the military, the distance of the military from most parts of society, the lack of understanding of the military and the nature of the wars that we're fighting, that actually are, in a sense, distorting perhaps some of the choices that you set out in the options there?
Jonathan, you've spelled it out extremely well. Let's take a British example. The Falklands War, over 100 Army and Royal Marine casualties in the land environment. Desert Storm, Bosnia and Kosovo were popular, and they were supported, and protection wasn't as important a factor. The British Army warriors that fought in Desert Storm, Bosnia and Kosovo weighed about 34 tons. The warriors in Afghanistan now weigh 40 tons, and that's almost all additional protection. So if you're designing an army, or for that matter a navy and air force, my belief is that people who are designing armed forces must benchmark them against the inconvenient truth that they may need to fight an opponent who is competent, capable and willing to fight, something I think that people tended to lose sight of in the 1990s. Now, that doesn't mean you necessarily have to design all your equipment to have a very high standard of protection, provided you thought through how you might add it on if you found yourself in an unpopular war rather than a popular war. And I think for those the US forces, Western NATO armies, who I think have suffered a number of strategic shocks in this area, they also need to be thinking about how they could revert and actually do things in a more mobile, less protected way, if that was appropriate. And I think that's part of your planning and your flexibility and agility. But just to bring this to life as an example, I was at an event in February where the chief of plans of an African army said we've been doing quite a bit of local operations in and around our borders and contributed to UN peacekeeping operations in Afghanistan. And we find our armour fleet, which is based on BRDM, PT-76 and T-55, is perfectly adequate for this, but it could do with a deep maintenance and a bit of an upgrade in the way that many countries, for example, have upgraded their T-55 tanks by adding modern electronics. That seems to me to be a perfectly respectable proposition for that particular African army, but one would hope within the general staff, if they suddenly find themselves doing something that is unpopular, they've got the flexibility and agility to ramp up their protection, whether it's adding protection to those armoured vehicles or having a pool of more protected armoured vehicles. That's the way I think, that's the way I'd recommend that armies thought about it. But the points you made, Jonathan, spot on.
Please.
Scott Klein, U.S. Army. There are a number of people within the MOD and also the DoD in the States that make the claim that despite years of multi-service operations, we still haven't achieved the appropriate level of jointness. Do you agree with that statement? And if so, where could we combine forces to gain greater efficiencies without diluting the strengths of the single services within their respective domains?
I'm not sure many company commanders who, in the firefights going on today in Afghanistan, are calling on their joint tactical air controllers at quite a low level, would agree with the observation you started with. And it seems to me that in Western armed forces there's been a tremendous improvement in air-land cooperation, which before 9/11 was really only practiced at the sort of really integrated level, I think, by the US Marine Corps and also a number of Western Special Forces. But this is now, hugely embedded, I think, in armies and air forces. There are a number of areas of joint warfare that haven't been exercised. Areas that involved armies. There's been very, very little serious amphibious operations, which of course do depend on the amphibious force being able to land a landing force. There's been very little sort of air-land movement, delivering people by parachute or tactical air landing over strategic distance since the 2001 intervention in Afghanistan and the intervention in Iraq. So there's a whole load of joint areas, I think, joint areas of capability that Western forces are pretty rusty in, and they need to start rebuilding that capability for a general purpose expeditionary role. I think there are joint initiatives that can be pursued by armies that can make them more efficient as national armies and national air forces. I think a good example here in the UK is the creation of a joint command for all battlefield helicopters that has made the battlefield helicopter force, which comes from all four services of the UK, more flexible, more interoperable, done wonders for sort of cost effectiveness and rationalising bases and sorting out logistics. What there also is there also needs to be a dialogue within like-minded nations, particularly within NATO and between the US and its other major allies, about how within the NATO alliance, but also bilaterally, armies can make themselves more interoperable, and also in these very hard times where a bit of pooling and sharing of capability can help, and strategic partnership. An example of this is there is a project called Project Griffin, which is a bilateral initiative between the German army and the Dutch army to make themselves more mutually supporting, so that between them they're able to keep capabilities that both armies couldn't afford on their own. And I think that has to be complementary to it as well.
Sorry, Ian Rigdon from the Developments, Concepts and Doctrine Centre at Shrewsbury. Thanks, Ben. We're just about to, a follow-on point actually of Scott's really, we're just about to publish the joint operating concept for the UK Armed Forces, probably in the next couple of weeks. And it's interesting, I think the point about where we can integrate to a great degree in jointry in particular, I think there are several aspects to that. I mean, the first one is that we actually are doing joint on a regular basis anyway, particularly in the UK Armed Forces. The real level is the higher level of integration. So I think particularly in terms of headquarters and how they operate together. And the construct we're using is the business about, we're talking about integrated. Part of is being integrated. But you need integrators within each headquarters. So the maritime, land, air, we would envisage having military staff from all three services. And if one became more dominant, for example, a theatre headquarters, then we would then be able to easily assimilate those other components of the other maritime, land, air, etc. Components. The air you've already mentioned is one particular area we'll be very close. But I think also there's one fundamental point. I've been going through, I've only been in the shop a few months, but I'm going through all our doctrine, and we've never actually defined properly the land environment. There's no specific definition of the land environment in British doctrine. We talk about jungles, desert, mountains as the areas we might operate in. There's no specific definition. And that causes a bit of a problem when it comes to jointry, because, for example, littoral, how do we define that? Now, the US, you helpfully sort of define it as being from the land to the sea and the sea to the land, which makes an interesting lap over in the middle. We don't have that. We just talk about being dominating from the sea, the land strip, the coastal land strip. And that causes lots of issues, because actually in terms of the jointry, let's take in the 1960s or even earlier than that, take the Borneo confrontation, large riverine estuaries, large inland lakes. The Navy controlled the coast, the Army controlled the interior with the Royal Marines. So where does that balance fit between maritime and land forces? And likewise for inland lakes. In the First World War, East Africa, the Navy did an expedition across land for 7 months, deployed some ships into the middle of tail boats in Tanganyika, and they controlled that. So that was seen as a naval task. Likewise, in your deploying forces, contingent forces, your ports of disembarkation or embarkation, who controls that? The Navy should logically control the ports, and then the land forces from there onwards inwards. So there are some real issues in jointry which we need to kind of refine. But I think generally the way that we operate at the moment is pretty joint. The issue is not to lose it, and that's the thing that we're most concerned about.
The points that Ian's made, I wouldn't argue with. I have a vivid memory in Bosnia in the 1990s being told by an aggressive US Air Force colonel that I was standing 2 metres into his battle space. But I think those sort of attitudes have gone, and Iraq and Afghanistan have made them go. What if we come back to sort of armies globally? When you look in the military balance, you will find that there are boundary issues, and there are organisation boundary issues. There are some countries where the Air Force owns the paratroops and owns all the helicopters and all the UAVs. There are other armies where, places where the Army owns all that. There are some countries where the Navy entirely owns the Marines that are landed from the landing ship. In other cases, the Armies are part of the Marines, and there are all sorts of other odd boundary things. Now, the trick is to make sure that the boundary is no more than something that exists on a piece of paper in peacetime, and isn't something that the enemy can attack or lead to sort of bureaucratic infighting or weaknesses. And it refers to Scott, your question earlier, because of course in really big countries with big defence budgets and big forces, can you afford duplication and overlap in future? But where you've got duplication and overlap, you also have a bit of resilience against unexpected threats, and you've got a bit of capability to search. And that's another, in terms of the higher management of armed forces and armies, that's another issue that is difficult but has to be grappled with.
Just giving thought to Jonathan Katzenberg, journalist and member of the Institute, just giving thought to your three major options. what I think one's learned from Afghanistan and Iraq really is that they were very expensive and they were largely failures. And that might be quite controversial, but I feel those are the facts. And what one's going to see, and I'd like your view on this, is that given the budget constraints, given the public view in the UK and the US about long presences or occupations, armed forces are going to have to recognise that there's a public limit to a long presence in a place. You know, it's war fatigue. Vietnam, like Vietnam, they are not going to tolerate a long presence. Therefore, shouldn't armies and defence forces be thinking about more a raiding type force design, like the Israelis, who don't go in for a long time? They're in and out. They want to avoid a long presence in Gaza. They'll go in, but it'll be air dominant really, and with drones and greater accuracy, one can find this, and also use of special forces, paratroopers. One thing that fast in and fast out, and I think this is what the French strategy is. They'll go in, but they'll come out pretty quickly. And having this sort of raiding strategy also cuts down probably on your protection costs and your logistic chains that you have to sustain.
I think you have a point, up to a point, if I may. Raiding strategies are very seductive, but often are more difficult in practice. There's a very interesting article, I think it might have been in The Guardian recently, by a Somali who said, well, the only contact people in my village have had with the United States is when a couple of houses were destroyed by drones. But what we do see with some examples of what you might call effective raiding, take the US drone strikes in areas of Pakistan, is that is hugely dependent on a vast intelligence gathering organisation, which we are probably largely unaware of because, of course, it's highly classified. But I draw evidence on this in the time it's taken the US to ramp up to its current levels of drone strikes. And as a former military intelligence officer, it seems to me there must have been a huge effort put in to creating that mature intelligence picture over, maybe five or six years. I think this also applies to Israel's approach to Gaza, which is on its doorstep, which appears to be thoroughly penetrated by all sorts of Israeli intelligence, not least human intelligence. And which is geographically extremely convenient. But raiding, whether it's by special operations forces, land forces, or indeed air or maritime forces, doesn't give you control, and in some respects also hands over the narrative to those who are left there afterwards. But there are historically some quite good examples of it. I think, if I may, though, what I draw from the Vietnam analogy is that the US Army and the US Air Force, Vietnam was really bad news in every way in terms of the negative effects it had on the forces and also their position within US society. Both organisations went through a period of reflection where they tried to learn and digest what they thought were the really important lessons, both the tactical ones, the operational strategic ones, and the political military ones. And you saw some articulation of this, for example, in the Weinberger Doctrine or Colin Powell's Doctrine. And you can read about it, for example, in Schwarzkopf's or Colin Powell's memoirs, or indeed memoirs of US Air Force people of the same period. And they were in, therefore, the position that in the early 80s they were able to exploit a renewed interest in fighting and winning the Cold War within NATO, plus the Reagan defence dollars, to build this fantastic military instrument that, having stumbled in Desert One and Grenada, which reinforced their general sense of gloom, actually did a fantastic regime change operation in Panama, brilliantly executed. Desert Storm, brilliantly executed by the US Army and US Air Force. and also equip them quite well to do what they subsequently did in Bosnia and Kosovo. The danger is that there had been such recoiling from counterinsurgency that, with the exception of the US Special Operations Forces, a few oddballs who accepted that interest in counterinsurgency was career limiting, and the US Marine Corps, who to their credit kept the small wars tradition alive, they'd completely jettisoned the counterinsurgency lessons learned business, sowing the seeds of their whether you consider it's defeat or near defeat in Iraq or Afghanistan. So if instead of the great audience we've got here today, we had 40 chiefs of staff of 40 Western armies, what I'd be saying to them is that although this is the age of gloom, you should learn from the way that the US Army and US Air Force licked their wounds and repositioned themselves after Vietnam, but get it all right rather than just the major combat bit right.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Ben. That exhausts our time and concludes the formal portion of this session. We've only scratched the surface, but I think very usefully so. I certainly benefited a great deal from what you had to say, and I'm sure you benefited from the interrogation that you received here, and had to sharpen to focus some of the points of emphasis that we will pursue. Can I just briefly draw your attention to the fact that this time next week we have another event that you might be interested in attending. It'll feature Stephen Pfeiffer and Ted C. talking about the next steps in nuclear arms control. That's on Wednesday the 15th at 1:30. And then the following Wednesday we'll have a number of people speaking on Pakistan's election results, what they mean for the country, the region and the world, it says here. So that might take up more than the allotted hour by the sound of it. But in any case, please, in the meantime, join me in thanking Ben for the talk he gave today.